The classroom smelled faintly of pencil shavings and that strange mix of perfume and sweat that clung to the air after a long day. Emily Carter sat near the window, half listening to the teacher's monotone about colonial history. She was 14 years old, the kind of girl people rarely noticed unless they needed a pencil or someone to copy homework from. Her brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, a few rebellious strands falling across her face, and her sweater sleeves hung slightly too long, covering the tips of her fingers. It happened so quickly, so casually, she almost wondered she had imagined it. A group of girls near the back row were whispering and giggling. One of them, Lisa, leaned forward just enough for her voice to carry across the quiet. "You're not even pretty enough to get bullied," she said, the words sharp and precise, like glass breaking in a small room. For a second, no one reacted, and Emily's mind scrambled to make sense of it. Then the laughter came, scattered at first, then swelling into a cruel chorus. Even the boys at the far side of the room smirked, not entirely sure what had been said, but sensing that something mean had just happened. The teacher didn't notice. He was still writing dates on the board, his back turned to the scene. Emily kept her eyes on her notebook, though she wasn't writing anything. Her hand hovered over the paper, pen trembling slightly. She told herself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. But the words, those strange, awful words, looped in her mind louder than the laughter. Not even pretty enough to get bullied. She had heard insults before, the occasional snide remark about her clothes or how quiet she was. But this one was different. It didn't just say she wasn't beautiful. It said she didn't matter, that she wasn't even significant enough to be worth someone's cruelty. For the rest of the class, she barely moved. Each tick of the clock seemed to echo inside her chest. When the bell finally rang, she gathered her books slowly, letting everyone else leave first. Lisa brushed past her, the faint scent of strawberry lip gloss lingering in the air, her laughter still in Emily's ears. The walk home was quiet. The late autumn sky hung low, gray clouds pressing against the horizon. Emily's sneakers scuffed against the pavement, and every step felt heavier than it should. She replayed the moment in her mind, searching for a response she could have made, something clever, something that would have made them stop. But nothing came. She had just sat there, silent, letting the words sink into her skin. That night, after dinner, she went to her room and shut the door. The mirror above her dresser caught her reflection, and for a long moment she simply stared. Her eyes were muddy brown, her nose a little too straight, her lips thin and pale. She turned her head, examining herself from different angles, but each view looked the same, ordinary, the kind of face that faded in a crowd. She thought about Lisa's words again. They weren't just about beauty. They were about visibility, about worth. If you weren't beautiful, at least you could be memorable for the wrong reasons. But what was she if she wasn't even that? Emily sat on the edge of her bed, pulling her sweater sleeves over her hands. She imagined herself as a faint pencil sketch, lines barely visible, easy to erase. It was a strange kind of pain, not sharp like an insult you could fight back against, but dull and deep, the kind that settles somewhere inside you and refuses to leave. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a quiet, steady pressure building, like a tide rising beneath the surface. She didn't have the words for it yet, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to feel this way ever again. Long after the house had gone silent, Emily sat at her desk, flipping through an old notebook. On the last page, she began to write, not about Lisa, not about the classroom, but about herself. Small sentences at first, awkward and hesitant. Things she liked. The way rain sounded against her window, the smell of old books, the satisfaction of finishing a drawing even if no one saw it. They were scraps of identity, fragments she could hold on to. When she finally lay down, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Her thoughts were still tangled, the sting of the day fresh, but somewhere inside, a decision had begun to take shape. No one would ever get to tell her who she was again, not Lisa, not anyone. If she had to build herself from nothing, piece by piece, she would. That night, Emily didn't fall asleep easily, but when she finally did, the words from earlier still echoed in her mind. Only now, Instead of feeling like a wound, they felt like the first line in a story she hadn't yet written. By the time Emily turned 16, the sharp edges of her early teenage years had softened, but the memory of certain moments still lay buried beneath her skin. She didn't talk about them, not to her parents, not to the few friends she had, and certainly not to herself out loud. Instead, she began to fill her life with quiet rituals, small acts of care that, at first, felt like survival and, over time, became something more deliberate. She started waking up earlier than she needed to, not out of discipline, but because she liked the way the world felt before anyone else was awake. She would sit by the kitchen window with a mug of tea, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. The stillness gave her room to think, though she rarely dwelled on the past. Her focus was on what could be changed. She began researching nutrition, experimenting with simple, healthy meals she could prepare herself. It wasn't about dieting. It was about learning to treat her body as something worth taking care of. In her free time, she wandered to the small library near her school. She picked books almost at random, novels with worn covers, collections of poetry, biographies of people she had never heard of. Each book felt like a conversation with someone wiser, someone who might help her see the world in a way she hadn't before. The story stayed with her, giving her words for feelings she hadn't known how to name. One afternoon, while walking past a second-hand shop, she noticed a used camera in the window. It was scratched along the edges, clearly well-loved, but something about it drew her in. She spent the next 3 weeks working extra hours at the local cafe, saving enough to buy it. Photography became her quiet obsession. She wandered the streets, capturing the way light fell across brick walls, the way rain beaded on the petals of flowers, the way people's expressions changed when they didn't know anyone was watching. Her pictures weren't about perfection. They were about finding the beauty in things most people didn't notice. By the time she was 19, she had developed a rhythm to her life. She worked part-time jobs, first at the cafe, then at a bookstore, and used the money to enroll in a short course on communication. Public speaking terrified her, but she wanted to learn how to use her voice in a way that could hold people's attention. The first class was a disaster. Her hand shook so badly she dropped her notes. But the instructor, a woman named Claire with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth, encouraged her to keep trying. Confidence, Claire told her, is built like muscle. You have to exercise it before it can hold its own weight. Emily practiced in front of the mirror, then in front of a small group of classmates. Slowly, her words stopped getting stuck in her throat. She learned how to pause without panicking, how to look at someone directly without feeling like she was about to disappear. The changes were subtle, but they began to weave themselves into the fabric of her days. By 22, she had started sharing her photographs online. At first, her posts were sporadic, captions short and unsure. But as more people stumbled across her page, she began to write longer pieces alongside her images, small reflections on self-worth, moments of beauty in everyday life, reminders that being noticed wasn't the same as being valued. Followers trickled in slowly, then more steadily. People commented on how her work made them feel seen, how her words captured emotions they couldn't articulate. It was never about the numbers for her. She ignored the advice to post trendy content or chase virality. Instead, she treated her page as a personal gallery, a collection of moments that told the story of someone learning to see herself clearly. Every time she hit publish, it felt like planting a seed, not knowing who it might reach or how it might grow. Her parents didn't fully understand the depth of what she was doing, but they noticed the changes in her. She carried herself differently now. Shoulders no longer slouched, voice steady even in unfamiliar situations. She still had quiet days, moments when self-doubt crept back in, but they didn't hold the same power they once did. Looking back, she realized that she had been rebuilding herself piece by piece, without fanfare, without grand declarations. There had been no dramatic turning point, only the steady accumulation of small, deliberate acts. She had chosen books over silence, a camera over invisibility, practice over fear. And without even noticing it, she had become someone new, not because she had erased the girl she once was, but because she had learned to carry her differently. It was in this quiet, intentional space that the next chapter of her life began to form, though she couldn't yet see it coming. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, she felt steady on her own feet, ready for whatever came next. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Emily's phone rang. She had been editing a new batch of photographs at her small desk by the window, the steady drizzle outside turning the streets into sheets of silver. She almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers often meant telemarketers, but something in her gut told her to pick up. The voice on the other end was warm yet formal, introducing herself as a representative from Luminance, a high-profile lifestyle magazine Emily had admired for years. "We've been following your work for a while now," the woman said, her tone calm but brimming with a hint of excitement. "Your photography, your writing, there's a depth to it that resonates. We like to feature you as our Face of the Year." Emily blinked, unsure if she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, half laughing out of disbelief. The representative explained that Face of the Year wasn't solely about physical beauty. It celebrated individuals whose presence and work inspired others. "It's about influence, authenticity, and how you've touched people's lives," she continued. "You're not just nominee. You've been selected." The conversation ended with arrangements for a photo shoot and an interview, and Emily set the phone down on her desk as if it were made of glass. She stared at the wall for a long moment, her mind scrambling to process what had just happened. A small part of her waited for a follow-up call that would tell her it was all a mistake. But no such call came. The shoot took place in a bright, airy studio in the city, a space full of light and polished concrete floors. Stylists bustled around her, brushing her hair, adjusting fabrics, setting the perfect angles. She had never been in such a space before, yet she felt oddly calm. The photographer, a tall man with gentle manners, didn't ask her to pose in exaggerated ways. "Just be you," he said, capturing her between conversations, mid-laugh, mid-thought. It was less about staging beauty and more about catching the truth of her presence. The article went live 2 weeks later. At first, she didn't check the comments or the social media buzz. But messages began to flood in, some from strangers who had followed her work quietly for years, others from people she had never met but who felt connected to her words. They wrote about how her posts had helped them through lonely nights, how her photographs reminded them to notice the small, overlooked details in life. The story spread quickly, shared on blogs, reposted across different platforms. Her follower count surged overnight, but what struck her most was the tone of the responses. People weren't just talking about her appearance. They were talking about her resilience, her perspective, her voice. One comment read, "This is the kind of beauty the world needs, one that makes you feel like you're enough." She read it twice, letting the words sink in. Interviews followed, radio, podcasts, even a small television segment where she spoke about self-acceptance and the importance of seeing oneself beyond surface definitions. She wasn't used to so much attention, but she reminded herself that she wasn't performing. She was simply sharing her truth. On the night of the magazine's official gala, she stood in front of her mirror in a long, deep green dress, her hair swept back to reveal the curve of her neck. The girl staring back at her looked composed, luminous, nothing like the one who had once avoided eye contact in crowded rooms. When she stepped onto the carpet at the event, flashes erupted around her, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the weight of that journey pressing gently against her chest. At the reception, editors and photographers approached her, offering congratulations, asking about her next projects. She listened, smiled, and spoke without hesitation. The conversations felt like bridges, each one a connection built from years of quiet work. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed and a host took the stage to announce the honorees, her name was called. Applause rolled through the room, warm and genuine, and as she walked up to receive the award, she felt something shift inside her, not pride in the conventional sense, but a deep acknowledgement. She had taken the raw clay of her life and shaped it into something worth sharing. When she left the venue that night, the city streets were wet from an earlier rain, neon lights reflecting in the puddles. She held the award in her hands, not as proof of her worth, but as a quiet reminder that she had been seen, not for what she was expected to be, but for who she had chosen to become. What she didn't know yet was that the ripples from that night would reach places she hadn't anticipated, carrying her name into conversations she thought had long been buried. 3 days after the gala, Emily was back in her apartment. sitting cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open, sorting through a backlog of emails. Most were media inquiries or brand offers, some flattering, others clearly opportunistic. She had learned to be selective, answering only the ones that aligned with her work and values. The afternoon light filtered in through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the coffee table where her phone lay charging. The notification arrived without fanfare, a single vibration that made the phone shift slightly against the wood. She picked it up, expecting another routine message, perhaps from a friend or her agent. Instead, the sender's name stopped her cold. Lisa. She hadn't seen that name in years. It was as if someone had reached into the locked drawer of her memory and pulled out something she had intentionally kept buried. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, thumb hovering but not yet opening the message. She could almost hear the echo of that classroom, the way the air had felt heavy, the murmur of laughter that had followed those words. Finally, she tapped the notification. The message was brief. "Hey, remember me?" No emojis, no exclamation points, just a question that felt heavier than its 6 words should allow. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the past, only an implication that Lisa knew Emily would remember. Emily leaned back against the couch, phone resting loosely in her hand. She wasn't angry, not in the way she might have been years ago, but the message stirred a physical reaction, tightness in her chest, a faint tremor in her fingers. It wasn't just about Lisa. It was about the version of herself that had existed back then, the one who had believed she was invisible. She placed the phone on the table and stood, moving to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. The sound of the liquid hitting the glass was grounding, a small reminder of the present moment. She sipped slowly, considering her options. She could ignore the message, delete it, pretend it had never arrived. But she knew herself too well. Silence wouldn't make it disappear. The words would linger, unanswered, taking up space in her mind. Her first instinct was to ask why now, but the truth was it didn't matter why. The past wasn't suddenly undone because Lisa had reached out. Still, Emily found herself curious, not about Lisa's life, but about her own reaction. Why was she calm when the memory was anything but? The phone buzzed again, the second message. Saw the article. You look different. In a good way. Emily read it twice, her lips pressing into a thin line. Compliment or not, it carried an unspoken weight. The girl who had once dismissed her so easily was now acknowledging her, even if she didn't have the courage to apologize outright. Emily returned to the couch, pulling her knees close and resting the phone on them. She thought about all the work she had done over the years, the early mornings, the small acts of self-care, the moments when no one had been watching. None of it had been for Lisa, and yet here was Lisa, drawn back into her orbit by the very life Emily had built without her. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she opened her laptop again and lost herself in editing a new series of photographs, letting the colors and textures absorb her focus. But the messages remained in the corner of her mind, like a faint hum she couldn't quite ignore. That night, as she prepared for bed, she picked up the phone one last time. She read both messages again, searching for any trace of remorse, but finding only the vague curiosity of someone who wanted to reconnect without confronting the past. She placed the phone face down on the nightstand, deciding that her response, if there would be one, would come on her own terms, not in the rushed impulse of the moment. As she lay in the dark, she realized something unexpected. The thought of replying didn't make her feel small. It didn't bring back the weight of being 14 and overlooked. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff she had already climbed, looking down at the terrain she had crossed. The distance between then and now was immense, and for the first time, she could see it clearly. Whatever she decided to say, it would not be about reopening old wounds. It would be about closing a chapter that had been left unfinished for too long. And deep down, she knew she already had the words. The next morning was quiet. The rain from the night before had left the streets glistening, and the air carried that clean, cool scent that always followed a storm. Emily stood by the kitchen counter, her coffee growing cold beside her as she scrolled through her messages again. Lisa's name was still there at the top of the list, those 2 short sentences unchanged, waiting. Emily didn't feel rushed. She had given herself a full night to let the weight of the situation settle, and now the decision felt less like a burden and more like an act of choice. She carried her coffee to the small desk by the window, opening her laptop but not touching the keyboard. The city outside was just beginning to stir, and the sound of a bus rumbling past below was oddly comforting. She picked up her phone, tapped the message thread, and rested her thumbs lightly over the screen. There was no anger in her, no lingering desire to lash out. Instead, there was clarity, a calm awareness of exactly what she wanted to say. She began typing slowly, the words deliberate. I remember you. I remember how you made me feel invisible. She paused, reading it over. It wasn't an accusation dressed in rage, nor was it an invitation for reconciliation. It was a statement, plain and unmoving, the kind that didn't demand a reply. She added nothing more, no questions, no softened edges. Then she pressed send. The message left her phone with a small whoosh, disappearing into the invisible space between her and Lisa. Emily set the device down and leaned back in her chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The room felt the same, yet something inside her had shifted. It wasn't relief in the way people often described it. No sudden lightness, no rush of victory. It was quieter than that, steadier. The hours passed without a response, and Emily found herself unexpectedly grateful. She didn't want to be pulled into a conversation about the past. This wasn't about hearing excuses or explanations. It was about stating the truth once and letting it stand on its own. Later that afternoon, she went for a walk through the park. The sky had cleared entirely, and the sun filtered through the last of the wet leaves, making them glisten as though strung with gold. She walked without hurry, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, feeling the familiar rhythm of her steps on the gravel path. Around her, strangers passed by, joggers, parents with strollers, elderly couples moving slowly side by side. She realized how many lives were unfolding all at once, each with its own history of wounds and quiet victories. Halfway through the park, she sat on a bench near the pond. Ducks glided across the water, leaving small ripples behind them. Emily thought about how far she had come, not in the sense of success or recognition, but in the way she could now hold the past without letting it consume her. There was a time when Lisa's words might have defined her for years, shaping how she saw herself. Now, they were simply part of a longer, richer story. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket, and she knew it was Lisa. She didn't check it right away. Instead, she watched the water a little longer, letting the ripples fade. When she finally took the phone out, she saw the preview of the message. I didn't know it affected you like that. Emily locked the screen without opening it. The words were an apology, and she didn't need them to be. She had already said what she needed to say. On her way home, she stopped at a small bakery and bought a loaf of fresh bread. The woman behind the counter smiled warmly, and Emily smiled back, realizing how much space such simple exchanges now held in her life. They felt bigger than any confrontation could. That evening, she sat at her desk again, not to write back to Lisa, but to work on a new series of photographs. This one was different, less about the city and its strangers, more about fragments of her own life. A teacup half full of cooling tea, a window streaked with rain, the shadow of her own hand on the wall. She wasn't trying to make them beautiful. She was trying to make them honest. When the first image loaded on her screen, she felt that same stillness she felt after sending the message earlier. It was a stillness of having nothing left to prove, of standing on the other side of the story and realizing it no longer had the power to pull her back in. She didn't know if Lisa would ever understand the weight of those words from years ago, and perhaps it didn't matter. The chapter was closed. And for the first time, when she thought of that classroom and the laughter that had once followed her, it felt distant, almost faded, not erased, because some things could never be erased, but softened into something she could hold without pain.